All right, let's catch up a little bit. I've been messing around the past couple days. I converted my bender to be hydraulic. With this guy, I got it off the bench to bleed the air out because it was acting funny. But that's done. Check that video out. My first bend with the tube bender turned into me kind of prototyping a rear end, and I didn't really film a lot of it because honestly I didn't think I was going to like it. All right, here we go. Bent like a dream. And that is going to be the back portion of the seat. I actually really like it a lot. So that 180-degree bend from the bender video, I cut into pieces to make it a hair wider, and then I bent 2 pieces at 25 degrees here and turned them at a little bit of an angle. And honestly, it ends up looking pretty good. It's a little narrower in front than in the rear, which is normal. My plan is to notch out where I drew a little circle here for some pieces that I turned on the lathe that I'm going to thread to M8. And then run a plate from here down, probably 1/8 inch plate to bolt to those. Brace that up towards the inside also with a lateral piece. And also where this piece, the filler rod is, I'm going to bend another tube about like that will run up and support the back that it can bolt to that bolt, which is actually for the old subframe. After I get that subframe figured out, since the front forks are done, we'll have a motorcycle that has a full suspension and a motor that runs. It'll look like a motorcycle at least, again. Kind of surprised this worked, but I didn't really expect it to, but here we are. The hard part's going to be making a second one that's the same. I'm loving the shape of that. That worked out perfect. So now it's time to weld up what I got. My only concern with welding is these tabs here. This little piece of filler wire is a spacer, so I wanted to weld them where there's some space in there so that they don't shrink or anything, but I'm worried about these tabs flexing, so what I'm going to do is take this off, weld the inside a little bit, put it back on, fully weld the outside. That'll make it want to, if it's going to go anywhere, I want it to go this way. And then while that's cooling off and locked in position with the bolts, I'll weld as much as I can on the back, and then the front will be cold by then, and I'll pull it off and finish weld everything else. I don't think I showed these yet, but I 3D printed some pieces that fit perfectly around the tube. And there's a couple reasons for these. The big one is marking a perfect circle that I can cut to when I want to cut a tube in a really specific spot. The chop saw and everything does fine, but it's nice to have a mark. You can cut a little big and sand right up to your mark. So these are pretty nice. And I also made some bent ones that go perfect. The bent ones go around perfect. The bent ones go around the tube as well. So you want to cut as square to the tube as you can so that your cross section is round. If you cut at an angle, your cross section isn't round. And they make fancy tools for this, but I didn't have any of the fancy tools for 7/8 OD, so I just 3D printed these real quick. And if you get them lined up and mark around that, you get a nice circular cross section to cut. Well, I'm going to use these on this, and when you press it all down, it'll make sure everything's nice and flat. So just a yummy little half a weld in there. We get all the other joints cleaned up and then do as much welding with this thing bolted up as I can. But this big weld on the inside is going to want to pull this tab up, and I'll get it to fit with a spacer, and then when I weld the outside, it hopefully will even out a little, won't warp too much. Well, got a little carried away there. I started knocking the junk off the tubes where I was going to weld, and then figured I'm going to have to do it all anyway. So I broke all the tacks and cleaned all the tubes up, so they're pretty much ready for paint. Then I made a couple adjustments in the back to get everything square while I had the tacks broken, but now everything's clean and ready to weld. So I'm going to do a couple welds while this is all together, and then take it off and weld the rest on the bench. And that is the completed, at least the hard part, of the subframe. It's about what I would expect using the rear peg positions. Yeah, I like it. So as you can see, the stock Virago shock is about 3.5 inches longer than the R6 shock, so I'm going to need to make an adapter. So I roughed this out on the computer. The blue part is going to be made out of aluminum, and the green bushings will be made out of steel. This should help a little bit with wear and longevity. And also, there are a couple dimensions where the aluminum stock that I have isn't quite big enough to fit real tight. So if I make the bushings just a couple thou proud of the aluminum, I'll get a much better fit that way. And luckily I had this piece of aluminum stock from a different project that is the perfect size. So using the dimensions from the model, I can do a little bit of layout. And once that's done, I can come over and start drilling and boring these holes for the bushings. I start with the center drill to make sure that the hole location is perfectly where I want it. Then I drill a little bit bigger hole. This is about 1/2 inch. And the reason I do that is because when I'm doing these plunging bores with an end mill, if the end mill isn't specifically center cutting, it'll rub in the center of the tool, and that'll make your hole a goofy size or shape and also put all kinds of stress on the tool and the machine and the part, and you don't want that. Another thing I'm using in conjunction with some layout is this edge finder. As you can see, when you slowly press the edge finder up against the part, its motion smooths out, and then as soon as it kicks off to the side, you know you're applying pressure. Then you can move exactly another 100 thousandths, that's the radius of the tip of the edge finder, and the center of your tool is then right over the edge of your part. Then you can just move where you want your hole and drill and bore that hole. So as expected, the part doesn't fit. I'll need to cut a couple of angles to clearance it so that it fits in the frame. To do that, I approximately measured the angles I needed, and then I'm just moving the vise. These angles aren't super critical, so I can just butt the vise up against my angle finder and call it good enough and clamp it down. I also set up a hard stop for the part to butt up against. And every time I do that, I like to unclamp and reclamp the part before I start. That way the whole setup is a little more consistent. Every time I unclamp and reclamp, it'll be in the exact same spot. Once that's set up, I can cut one side, and then when that's done, flip the part over, put it up against the stock, and I know that if I take the machine to the exact same spot, both of those cuts will be perfectly symmetric. She fits. You can see the hole, the back side of the hole is there, which means it's actually a hair deep, so I'm gonna have a little bit of clearance. And when I put that bushing in there, I'll have lots of room. Nice. So now it's time to make some bushings. I have the approximate dimensions after I measured the bores, and I know the size of the fasteners, so I can get to those on the lathe. These are all made out of like a hardware store, low carbon steel. It does not leave a very good surface finish, so I make everything like this a thou or two big and then sand it down to size. I want a nice tight fit in the aluminum, not a press fit, but it helps a lot when both of those surfaces are nice and smooth, and I can get within a thou or two and then everything will fit perfectly. Now that I know that the aluminum part with the bushing fits, I'm going to cut the slot for the shock to fit. I do a quick plunge slot and then take a couple of dimensions here to make sure I'm right centered where I thought I was. Then from there I can do another rough cut and a finish cut, and the slot is done. Also made the two steel bushings that will go through the aluminum part that the shock will mount to, and the two bushings that will go where the pin mounts the shock to the swing arm. And that completes all of the parts for this R6 shock retrofit kit into the Virago. I cleaned up the aluminum part and chamfered the edges to make it look nice, and now it's time for final assembly. And would you look at that? And I'm really happy with how this is turning out. Looks really good. I am getting excited about the bike again. Seems like a good place to wrap up this episode, so thanks for watching.